They thought she was just a grieving widow, just a woman with a windmill and a patch of dry land. But when they came to break what she had left, they didn't know. Every drop of water here had a guardian, and every ditch, dam, and tunnel was waiting for them. The sky was molten gold, the last light of day bleeding into the jagged lip of the canyon. Clara Boone stood on her porch, one hand curled loosely around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The windmill turned slow and lazy in the warm evening breeze, its weathered blades catching glints of the dying sun. That windmill had been her heartbeat since Elias died. It pulled water from the deep earth, feeding the cattle, the gardens, and the stubborn roots of her life. Without it, the ranch would shrivel into dust and memory. The sound of hooves reached her before the dust did, a low, steady rumble, like thunder in the belly of the earth. She set the mug down on the railing, eyes narrowing as the horizon shifted. 5 riders emerged from the haze, their silhouettes long and sharp against the fire-colored sky. Even at this distance, their swagger was unmistakable. The man at their head rode a black gelding that seemed to drink the ground in heavy strides. Calder Briggs. His name carried through the frontier like the hiss of a snake before it struck. They didn't come for talk. She knew that before they even slowed. Calder swung down from his horse with the lazy confidence of a man who'd never paid for anything with honest work. His hat sat low over eyes that scanned the place not with curiosity, but ownership. The others fanned out, their boots thudding on the dry earth, their shadows stretching toward her windmill like reaching claws. "Evening, Mrs. Boone," Calder drawled, his voice roughened by dust and whiskey. "Shame about what's gonna happen to your pretty tower over there. But progress don't leave room for windmills and stubborn women." Her gaze didn't waver. "Progress," she said softly, as though tasting the word. "That what you call stealing a person's water?" He grinned without humor, turning toward the windmill. "Boys." The first blow landed with a hollow, metallic groan. A second strike split one of the wooden struts, sending splinters flashing in the sun. The windmill shuddered as though in pain, each blade groaning under the assault. Clara's fingers curled into her skirt, but her face remained a mask of quiet stillness. The air filled with the clang of steel on wood, the creak of metal joints forced past their will. She watched them work, methodical in their destruction, until the windmill's great frame leaned, hesitated, and surrendered. It toppled with a slow, almost graceful fall, slamming into the dirt with a crash that sent birds shrieking into the air. The water pump groaned once, coughed, and fell silent. Dust swirled in the sudden stillness, curling around the men's boots. Calder turned back toward her, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "There now," he said, breathless but smug. "You'll find the desert ain't so forgiving without that pretty tower turning." Her eyes slid past him to where the carcass of the windmill lay sprawled, one blade half buried in the earth. She thought of Elias, his hands blackened with grease, his voice patient as he explained the gears and pistons to her in the early years of their marriage. She remembered the way he'd run his hand along the windmill's post like it was a living thing. He'd once said that water was the true law of this land, more than guns, more than gold. Whoever controlled it survived. Her breath came slow. "Funny thing about this land, Mr. Briggs," she said at last. "It has a way of remembering." He laughed, the sound sharp against the quiet, and motioned for his men to mount up. "You got until next week, Clara. After that, this patch is mine." Their horses turned, kicking up gritty spirals that clung to her skin. She didn't move until they were no more than shadows against the deepening dusk. Then she stepped down from the porch, crossing the yard with unhurried steps. The corral fence was warm beneath her hand, the boards worn smooth from years of use. Her fingers slid over the familiar grain until they found the small, concealed notch beneath the middle rail. She rested her palm there, the cool edge of the iron switch hidden from sight. Her eyes traced the dry gullies cutting through the ranch, the shallow ditches that looked to an untrained eye like nature's work. The truth was buried deeper than the bandits could guess. Sluice gates, water tunnels, hidden reservoirs built in the days when Elias had more time than cattle to manage. She'd kept them maintained, every hinge oiled, every gate ready. The desert breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from somewhere far below. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the empty windmill settle into memory. The silence was heavy, but not final. The land still breathed beneath her, and she knew its every vein. Her hand lingered on the switch, not yet pulling it. That would come later, when the right moment ripened like a fruit in the sun. For now, she turned back toward the fallen windmill, her step steady, her jaw set. Some things in the West were built to stand. Others were built to fall. But Clara Boone had been built to endure, and she knew that the men who thought they'd broken her had just stepped into a game they couldn't see, one where every drop of water, every trickle in the dirt, was hers to command. The morning after the windmill fell, Clara hitched the mule to her wagon and steered toward town. The desert lay wide and silent, a pale gold under the rising sun, broken only by the low roll of distant hills. Every mile between her and the cluster of buildings ahead felt like a measured breath before a storm. She kept her posture easy, her expression unreadable, though inside her thoughts moved quick as creek water after a rain. The town was no bigger than a man could walk in 10 minutes from one end to the other. A crooked street of false-fronted buildings, weathered signs, and a single plankboard sidewalk shaded by sagging awnings. The air held the smell of dust, tobacco, and the faint sourness of last night's beer spilled in front of the saloon. Clara stepped down from the wagon in front of the mercantile. The bell above the door gave a tired jangle when she pushed inside. Shelves sagged under sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, and jars of penny candy. Mr. Greeley, the shopkeeper, gave her a nod but didn't press her with talk. He knew her as a woman who spoke only what she needed. While she counted out coffee beans and salt, voices drifted from the back of the store. 2 cowhands were leaning near the counter, their words low but clear enough if one listened right. "Briggs says he's going to push her clean out tonight," one said, his tone holding both admiration and fear. "Says she'll be gone before the week's out. After last night, she'll fold. Can't run a ranch without a windmill," the other replied. "Besides, that land ain't worth the fight, unless you want the water rights." They laughed, the sound like grit in the teeth. Clara kept her eyes on the coffee sack, tying it with deliberate slowness. She'd heard enough talk like that over the years to know it for what it was, not idle rumor, but the kind of confidence that comes from a plan already set in motion. She paid Greeley, loaded the supplies in the wagon, and turned toward the hitch rail. Hank Doyle was leaning there, his hat tipped back on his head, silver stubble catching the sunlight. He'd worked cattle with her husband years ago, before the railroad came through and pulled half the hands away. His blue eyes still held a rancher's watchfulness, even if his back was bent now. "Heard about your windmill," he said without preamble. She rested one boot on the wagon step. "Word travels fast." "You know what they're after," Hank said, glancing toward the saloon where Calder's black gelding was tied. "That well of yours runs deep, and that canyon spring your husband tapped? Only reason you got green grass when everyone else is feeding dust." Clara met his gaze. "Elias always said water's the real currency out here. The rest is just paper and lead." Hank scratched his jaw. "Let me ride out with you. Ain't got much left worth my keeping. I can stand watch." She smiled faintly, the kind that warmed but didn't invite. "Appreciated, Hank. But this is my land. Best I see to it myself." He frowned, ready to argue, but she was already climbing onto the wagon seat. "You'll see," she said quietly, flicking the reins. "They all will." By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was angling west, the air heavy with heat. She unhitched the mule, set the supplies inside, and walked the fence line. Her boots scuffed over dust and sparse grass, but every so often she paused beside a shallow ditch, stooping to clear a stray tumbleweed or adjust a narrow plank across the water's path. These ditches looked like nothing, a trickle of water winding through the earth, but each one was part of a system that ran deeper than any stranger would guess. She checked the sluice gates, her fingers finding the iron handles hidden under brush or low boards. She tested the hinges, listening to the smooth grind of metal that hadn't rusted in years. Elias had built them to last, and she'd kept them ready. As the day cooled, she moved the cattle from the low pasture to the higher ridge behind the barn. The herd moved slow and stubborn, their hooves sucking at the damp soil near the troughs. The sheep went next, driven into a pen on the rise, where the ground stayed dry. She didn't need a stampede in the middle of the night if water came rushing through. The light shifted from gold to deep blue. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote's yip floated over the land, answered by another far off. Clara closed the last gate and stood still, feeling the air cool against the back of her neck. The windmill lay where it had fallen, a dark silhouette against the paling sky, but its absence didn't hollow her. The real work of the ranch hummed unseen beneath her boots. She walked the central ditch one last time. The moon had climbed high enough to paint the water's surface with silver. The narrow channels shone like strands of a web, each one leading somewhere purposeful. A low breeze rippled across the surface, making the moonlight dance. Clara paused, her eyes tracing the line of water disappearing into shadow. Somewhere out there, the men who thought they'd broken her were drinking and laughing, believing the desert had already claimed her. She let the thought settle, not with bitterness, but with the steady patience of someone who knew how to wait for the right moment. The ranch was ready. The land was quiet, and the water, hidden, patient, coiled like a sleeping serpent, was hers to command. Night laid a velvet hand over the canyon, and the ranch sank into a hush so complete the trickle of distant water sounded like a secret being told. Clara stood inside that quiet, a darker shade within the barn's deeper shadow, feeling the air cool against her cheeks. Moonlight glazed the yard in a thin, pewter sheen. The fallen windmill's ribs were a black corset against the sky. She listened until she could hear her own breath slow and steady, until the faintest tremor of the ground began to separate itself from the hum of crickets. They came as rumors do, soft at first, then undeniable. 5 horses, careful on their hoof falls, eased through the mesquite beyond the north fence. The men kept low, voices clipped and barely more than breath. Their confidence moved with them, a swagger that didn't need shouting. They believed in darkness and fear more than they believed in gates and locks, and they believed a woman alone couldn't hold land that men wanted. Clara slid a fingertip along the barn wall until it found the iron rings sunk into the wood near the ground. The metal was cool, slick with a faint dew of night. She counted silently, 1, 2, 3, and tugged. Somewhere beneath the earth, a weighted latch dropped with a muffled thunk. 100 yards away, a sluice gate shivered open. The sound reached her as a low throat clearing, a subterranean cough. Then water began to move. Not a roar. This wasn't a river breaking its banks, but a sure, insistent rush, like breath drawn in for a long-held note. It slid into the low ravine that curled behind the corral, pouring along a channel Elias had dug with the stubborn patience of a man who knew time would do half the work if you gave it a path. Moonlight caught the water's skin, turning it to a shaken ribbon of quicksilver. The horses scented it first. Calder's black gelding tossed its head, the bit ringing a nervous note. He hushed the animal with a hiss and a hand hard on the reins. The others, Pike, Finch, Moreno, and Ash, shifted in their saddles, peering into the silver wash. They hadn't expected any light, much less the sheen of moving water. The ravine had been dust the last time they'd scouted it. Land didn't change that quick, they thought, unless someone made it. Calder lifted a hand, the gesture curt and slow, the kind a man makes when he knows there's more danger in spooking a horse than in meeting a bullet. Easy, he murmured. His voice didn't carry far, but it carried enough. Just a trickle. Just a trickle was all she needed. The ravine, now a shallow, shining throat, offered its gentle invitation. The far bank looked firmer than the near. The cattle run beyond it looked like the straight, simple path to the house. They didn't see the narrowness of that run for what it was. They didn't see the tight corners that curved like a fist. Clara breathed once more and let go the second ring. A second gate lifted. The water moved faster, the sound deepening, a vibration in the boards under her boots. It fingered into hand-dug side channels, the grooves so neat they looked like the marks of some patient giant's comb. It struck turns and sped up, eddying in shallow bowls, then sprang forward again, quick and lively. The first horse's forelegs hit the slick slope, and its hooves slid. Not enough to fall, just enough to scramble, to search for purchase that wasn't there anymore. The animal lurched forward, choosing the only direction that offered momentum, down the ravine, through the wash, and into the cattle run where the earth, still dry, formed a narrow corridor between 2 waist-high walls of packed clay. Go! Pike snapped, eager to press the advantage he thought he had. He dug his heels into his mount sides and plunged after the first horse, water splashing up into a spray of cold flecks that glittered like thrown nails. The others followed, the ravine catching them up and spitting them into the chute Clara and Elias had shaped years ago. The world in there narrowed to the width of a wagon and the height of a man's shoulder. The moon couldn't reach down into that tightness. The sound of water, confined and purposeful, grew louder. Clara moved then, quietly, carefully, her skirt hem whispering against her boots. She slipped along the barn's far side and into the dark seam between the tack room and the smokehouse, her fingertips skimming bead by bead along memory's rosary. The notch in the post, the loose stone, the board that squeaked if stepped on the wrong edge. Her palm found the low lever sunk under the corral rail. Iron rasped softly against iron. Downstream, a small gate pivoted. Upstream, a hidden valve whispered open. The flow split, half surging into the run at the exact angle required to turn firm soil into treachery. The cattle run woke. Water chased itself along the trough like boys racing down a street, slapping and laughing. It lapped at hooves, lifted dust into mud, made a mirror of the ground where there had been nothing but grit. The horses snorted and balked, skittering sideways, the walls pressing in cold and unyielding. The men swore, first softly, then with teeth. Damn her! Finch snarled, kicking out of a stirrup to keep his balance as his horse danced. She's flooding us out. This ain't flood. Ash shot back, spitting. This is. He didn't have the word for it. Design. That was the word. A mind had shaped this current and measured its drop, and reckoned its speed against a horse's weight. Calder said nothing. He was listening with more than his ears, his gaze flicking from the rippling sheen underfoot to the angles of the run, to the way the water struck the inside of each corner and leaped ahead with more speed than the natural trickle should. A story he'd heard once, told in a train yard with bolts clattering and men passing tobacco, loosened itself from the dark. An engineer out on the line, who could pull a river around a hill, who could coax a spring to feed a field 3 ridges over just by speaking the quiet language of slope and fall. Elias Boone, they'd said, and Elias Boone's widow had married the land he left behind. Ahead, the run forked. To the left, it bent toward the chapel of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed. To the right, it fell straight as a church aisle toward the barn. The left looked like escape. The right looked like challenge. The water split there, too, in glittering decision. Left, Pike barked, because men with nerves prefer the softer turn. Clara, already moving along the fence in shadow, pressed one last lever beneath a clump of rabbit brush. A hidden flap closed. The left fork's water calmed, became shallow enough to lull, deep enough to slow. They took the bait. Pike turned left, cursing as his mount slogged, the mud catching like hands around its fetlocks. Moreno followed, leaning hard, trying to help his gelding find rhythm. The two of them were out of Calder's line now, voices blunted by the clay walls. The run narrowed farther on that path. The water would deepen in a long, low basin built for exactly this work. Not drowning, no blood tonight, but halting, chilling, humbling. It would take a quarter-hour to fight through, and another half to slog back if they changed their minds. In that time, shadows could move. Plans could tighten. Calder kept straight with Finch and Ash, and the current quickened beneath him, bright as a grin. He felt suspicion sharpen inside him, like a blade being honed. She's not panicking, he said, more to himself than to them. She's pointing. Moonlight braided silver into the water, and the ranch unrolled its quiet grammar, curve after measured curve. Each ditch a sentence Elias had written with a shovel and a string line. Clara moved with it, a shadow within shadows, letting her steps fall where years of habit told her the ground would not speak. Elias had shown her that first summer the language of fall and grade. He'd set a plumb bob swaying over a stake, while cicadas screamed in the cottonwoods, the line cutting a moon of shadow across his bare forearm. See, he'd said, there's weight even in stillness. Give water 1 finger's worth of slope, and it will walk to the end of the world. He had laughed then, soft and pleased, and she'd held the stake while he measured, the sun lifting white off the tin cup by his boot. They had drawn this ranch together, chalk on the barn wall, charcoal on a piece of flour sack, arrows and numbers, and little gates sketched like jewelry clasps. Irrigation first, protection later. A web that fed alfalfa and orchards, and if pushed, would turn teeth outward. Now the web flexed. The bandits split, where the corridor narrowed again, the maze peeling them apart like strands of rope teased by careful fingers. Pike and Moreno lunged toward a dimmer right-hand bend that promised darkness, and, to a tired horse, seemed like rest. Finch and Ash took a shallow step left, then the water rose at their knees with a soft intake of breath, and both reined back in surprise. Calder held center a heartbeat longer, weighing more than the ground. He listened the way men who live do, ears, eyes, the bottom of the spine, then chose the narrowest channel, the one that fell straight toward the yard lights guttering at the ranch house. Clara's palm found a lever beneath a tangle of saltbush. The iron was slick with dew and years of oil. She pressed it down a thumb's width, and somewhere a hidden board lifted, letting a pane of water slide into the right-hand pocket where Pike and Moreno floundered. The basin had been dug shallow but wide, its bottom tamped hard and then dusted with silt over the years, so it would give like cake when wet. Water climbed their horses' legs, the soft banks, patient until now, sloughed away in dirty folds, sucking at hooves and boots alike. Pike cursed, the sound frantic. High with a panic, he didn't know how to hide anymore. Moreno tried to steer toward the wall where the clay still held, but the wall surrendered as though exhaling. The men found themselves hip-deep without seeing the moment it had happened, each step heavier than the last. The basin curled back on itself in a crescent. The water rose to meet them in its slow, cold way. No bullets, no sharp edges, only weight. Pike slapped leather against his horse's neck, urging, pleading. The animal's chest heaved, its eyes rolled white. When the bank melted under the next lunge, Pike went to his knees in the muck and clawed forward with both hands, abandoning direction for the animal panic of finding any ground that held. Clara left them to the basin's lesson and slipped along the fence line, passing the place where Elias had once driven a post with 10 steady blows and then leaned on the hammer to grin at her. Wind had ripened his hair the color of wheat. Water had been the only thing that ever made him close his eyes to listen. He taught her patience by placing a pebble in her palm and telling her to hold it until she could feel its warmth leave. When a coyote took a lamb, he built the first stone pen, low and thick, and then showed her how a narrow run could make a wolf forget it knew how to turn around. This maze, these sluices and weirs and secret gates, had grown from the same faith. That fear, like flow, could be shaped if you knew the lay of the land. Finch and Ash hit the sump without warning. The ground there dropped 3 feet, a lip the moon failed to show, and a shelf of stone waited under the water like a bare tooth. The horses slid off it and went down to their chests, throwing up fans of cold that shivered into the night. Ash hauled at his reins, voice gone to a rasping growl. Finch swore and lost it entirely, kicking free of a stirrup as his mount shouldered sideways and found nothing to push against. Water surged into the sump from a hidden slot, with a sound like paper tearing. The animals flailed, tried to swim in a space too shallow for swimming and too deep for footing. And then Ash did the only thing that could be done. He cut his saddle free, the knife kiss-quick, leather groaning as it sloughed into the black. Finch, coughing and wild-eyed, followed, slashing the cinch until the rig tumbled and his horse lifted, lighter, confused, able to lunge toward a shelf of gravel where the water thinned. "Off!" Ash barked, and Finch obeyed with the blind obedience of a man who has just felt the earth promise to keep him. They stumbled onto the shelf, boots vomiting mud, clothes clinging. The horses churned in the sump, heads high, nostrils flaring, then found the cut in the wall and swam out along the course the water offered them, ghost shapes vanishing into willow shadow. Finch bent double, hands on his thighs, vomiting creek water and fear. Ash's face had lost the pretty mean his swagger gives. Something truer looked out, the stripped-down grit that holds a man together when the show is gone. Across a lattice of rails and a low stone rise, Calder appeared, a darker wedge in the night. He had not fallen. Water slicked his coat, drew lines of light along his sleeves. His gelding, shaking its head, stood belly-deep but steady, the animal's good sense a mirror of its riders. Calder's voice came flat and low. "Ash!" Ash lifted his head, that one syllable catching him, like a rope tossed across a river. Finch reached too, desperate to belong to some plan again, but Calder was already turning his horse toward the house lights, toward the place where power lived. Ash grit mud between his teeth and followed, quick and sure. Finch, left, found himself looking at water that slipped back, where he had just been, and at walls that curved toward one another like the pages of a closing book. Clara watched from the dark seam beside the smokehouse. The yard lay ahead, open enough to look like freedom, bounded enough to be anything but. A low wind lifted damp from the channels and set it on her skin like a cool hand. She could feel the maze's heart thumping now, a coupled rhythm of weighted gaits and long runs, each beat timed to the step of a horse, the jump of a man. There was one last gate to set, the final, quiet stroke that would turn the choice Calder believed he still held into a thin, exact line. Elias had stood where she stood more than once, measuring the drop with his eye, one hip cocked against the fence, the world spread like a map at his feet. If you close this and open that, he'd murmur, you turn a flood into a path. If you turn the path, you teach anything with legs where to go. When he died, alone in the canyon with a broken cinch and the rumor of a shove that the sheriff never proved, she had come out here at dusk and run her hand along every lever until the sting in her chest steadied into iron. The maze would stand for two reasons, to grow life and to hold it safe. Lantern light swung from a nail on the barn, its flames shivering whenever the night breathed. It threw a thin ellipse of ochre across the yard, picking out the slick sheen of mud, the scuffed crescent of a boot print, the steam lifting from a horse's wet flank. Clara stepped into that trembling circle and let it paint her face. Across from her, Calder reined in, water running off his coat and seams, his hat brim dripping silver. He looked at her like a man who'd come to a card table expecting paper and found the deck made of iron. Well, he said, the word easy as a yawn and edged like a saw. There's the lady of the springs. You fix your little ditches for this? To wet a man's boots. Her feet were steady in the muck. No, she said. I fixed them to teach a lesson you might live long enough to understand. Lesson. His laugh was too loud for the narrow yard. All I see is clay and a widow with nothing left to bargain but a ghost name. A name that made rivers behave, she said. Yours can't make a horse stand still. He leaned forward in the saddle, the black gelding flicking its ears back at the tone in his voice. Tell you what I see, Clara Boone. I see a woman who thinks water's a wall, and I've made a living walking through worse. You want this done quiet. Step aside. I'll leave you your house and a bed and enough fence to keep coyotes pretend honest. You keep the memory of that man and let the rest go. You wrecked what turned the wind, she answered, and the lantern made a small gold river in her eyes. This isn't a negotiation. Behind him, Ash ghosted in the half-dark, jaw hard, eyes cutting for exits that were already gone. Finch sagged by the corral post, drenched and ragged, his hands flexing with the memory of a cinched knife. Out in the dim, Pike and Moreno's voices came as ragged tugs, men digging themselves out of a slow grave of their own insistence. Calder shifted the reins to one hand and let the other drift down his thigh, not touching the gun there, not needing to. The gesture was theater, and he knew audiences better than he knew maps. You going to pray the water higher at me? He asked, easy again, almost friendly. Sing to your sluices, Mrs. Boone. Gravity listens better than men, she said, and it never drinks. His mouth curled. Then here's gravity. He put his heels to the gelding and came, not at a full run. He wasn't foolish, but with the kind of quick, thick charge that shrugs off puddles and fright. The lantern flame flattened, the shadow of horse and rider jumped the barn wall, and the ground started to tremble in the old way that makes a body think of buffalo. Clara moved a single step to her right and laid her hand under the lowest rail. The hidden hatch was there, the notch Elias had carved half a winter ago when wind cut, so sharp it made a blade of breath in the throat. She found the iron knob by feel and twisted. The sound that answered was intimate and final, a wooden throat opening, a plugged lung exhaling. Water, held back under the yard, dove through the hatch and down into a stone-lined pit, and in an instant the surface where Calder's horse found purchase became hollowed and slick. The gelding's forelegs hit that treacherous skin. Its clever body chose survival over charge. It threw its weight to keep from going belly down, and the shift turned momentum into a stagger. Calder's seat held a heartbeat, and then it didn't. He pitched forward and slid sideways, one boot catching, the other freeing, his hand splaying in a splash that stank of clay and tannin. He hit the yard on his knees in muck that clutched like a promise and rose to his thighs, because water obeys more faithfully than men ever do. Silence took a breath with him. The lantern hummed. Frogs that had kept quiet all summer remembered a song and tried a note. Calder wiped mud from his mouth with the heel of his hand and looked up at her. He didn't go for the gun. Muck doesn't just swallow weight. It steals urgency in little sips. He stared at her from knee-deep, wet to the bone, his pride raked raw into something cleaner. "You think this makes you safe?" he asked, quieter. Each word weighed. "You think it ends here, in your yard, with your tricks?" "No," she said. "It ends when you start walking." He barked a laugh he didn't believe in. "You'll march me past my own boys? In front of men I've pulled out of fires and fights? You want to test who they answer to when a woman starts giving orders?" Clara inclined her head, like someone listening for rain. "Ash," she called, not loud. "You've got sense enough to feel which way the ground tilts. How much longer you want to drag yourself through someone else's plan?" Ash flinched as though she'd laid a hand on his shoulder. His eyes touched the mouth of the run they'd come through, the subtle slicking that made the way back look different now. He did the arithmetic of exhaustion and found only one sum. "How deep you going to drown us?" he said to her, and then, before she could answer, "I'm done." Calder's head snapped toward him. "You're not." "I am," Ash said, and his voice didn't crack because it had already broken and healed some miles ago in another life. He unbuckled his gun belt and let it slip into the mud with a soft, ugly sound. The lantern light found the wet metal and made of it nothing at all. Clara eased another lever, this one hidden in the shadow of the trough. A low sluice woke with the sigh of a bed settling. The far side of the yard filled, slow at first and then steady. A ring ditch she and Elias had mocked as Coyote's moat when they'd built it. Thin water slipped around Finch's ankles, then his shins. He lifted his hands, palms out. The universal language of men, who finally noticed the world, has more than one kind of force. "All right," he said, ungentle plea running under the words. "All right." Out by the basin, Pike's cussing had gone ragged and small. Moreno's voice answered in Spanish in prayer. They were no longer fighting the water. They were talking to it, bargaining, like sinners who'd found themselves in a different church than the one they'd meant to enter. The moon slid from a veil of cloud and showed them not drowning, but being kept in one place by patience and grade. "Stand up," Clara told Calder. "Slow. Keep your hands where I can see them." He rose, the mud giving back in reluctant kisses around his legs. He was a large man made briefly ordinary, no height, no horse, nothing but body and breath and will. He stood, found his balance on the slick, and leveled a look at her that might have burned if the wind hadn't stolen half of it. "You parade me through town," he said, "and the memory of it will make some other man wilder." "The memory of it," she answered, "will make him cautious." She flicked the lantern's wick with a nail, coaxed it a shade brighter. Then she tossed him a coil of rope. The arc of it cut clean through the cold air and landed at his feet with a soft slap. "Tie your belt to Ashes. Finch, you next. Call your boys in. Tell them to come quiet." He stared at the rope as if it might speak. Pride and calculation had a small war in his eyes, but it ended in a single breath because time was against him now, and he was not the sort to drown in stubbornness when there was a road left. He bent, got his hands filthy, and made the knots hard and ugly. When Pike and Moreno stumbled into the yard at last, mud to their ribs, eyes glassed with cold, he didn't look at them at all, just lifted his chin at the rope and said, "On." The street held a stillness that wasn't quite silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles after a storm, when people step out of their doorways and take in what's been left behind. The sun was just lifting over the roofs, washing the crooked line of buildings in pale gold. Mud glistened on the boardwalks, pooling in the wagon ruts. 5 men stood in a rope line outside the sheriff's office, their heads down, boots dripping onto the packed dirt. The rope sagged between them, heavy with shame. Clara stood a few paces off, her hands loose at her sides, the lines of her face calm and unreadable. She wasn't smiling, but there was a settled look in her eyes, like the moment after a gate closes on the last stray calf. No one said much. A few whispers moved through the gathering crowd. Words like water traps and cunning and never fired a shot. But they were spoken low, as though repeating them too loud might summon something. The blacksmith leaned on his anvil, eyes narrowed in a way that spoke of a man filing this away for later retelling. The sheriff arrived at last, a horse lathered from the ride in, his coat still thrown over one shoulder. He reined up, scanning the street as though expecting to see smoke or blood. Instead, he found the scene already over, the prisoners already waiting. His brows pulled together. "What happened here?" he asked, swinging down from the saddle. Clara's voice was even. "They came for my land. I kept it." The sheriff's gaze went to Calder, who met it without flinching, then to the rope tying them together. "You bring them in alone?" "With help," Clara said. "From gravity, from the lay of the land, and from Elias Boone's hands, years before any of us knew we'd need it." The sheriff's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, then he shook his head in the smallest of disbeliefs and turned to lead the prisoners inside. He didn't ask for details. The truth, in its full shape, would travel without him. When the crowd began to thin, Hank Doyle came forward. He moved with the slow assurance of a man who's lived more years than he has left, his boots making soft sounds in the mud. He stopped beside her, his gaze on the departing prisoners rather than her face. "Elias would have been proud," he said finally. She looked at him, and for the first time since the windmill fell, her expression softened. "He taught me everything that mattered," she said. "The rest I learned by keeping it." Hank's mouth twitched into a small, approving smile. "That's how land's held. Quiet and steady." She didn't answer, but the weight in her eyes was thanks enough. By the time she drove her wagon back through the canyon road toward the ranch, the sun was high enough to warm the stones. The air smelled of wet earth and mesquite, the sweet aftertaste of her victory still curling in the breeze. The fallen windmill lay where it had landed, its long blade splayed like a broken star. She stepped down from the wagon and stood before it, the memories rising, Elias climbing the frame to oil the gears, his laugh drifting down to her, the hum of the blades when the wind was good. She set her gloves on and began the work. First the splintered struts were pulled free and set aside. Then the bolts loosened with careful turns. The lantern-like precision she'd used on levers and sluice gates the night before now guided her hands on wood and steel. Every piece lifted was laid down as if it might be part of something again, because it would be. A new frame would rise here, stronger than the last. She already knew where she'd cut the timber from the grove on the north edge, and which bolts she'd salvage from the old tool shed. She'd pour the footings deeper this time, and she'd use a heavier vein, so it would catch even the laziest breeze. By afternoon, she had the site cleared. The wind had picked up, whistling low through the open channels of the ranch. The water moved steady beneath her boots, its voice quiet but constant. She knelt by the main sluice, running her hand along the wood Elias had shaped. The grain was smooth with years, the joint still tight. She closed the gate she'd opened in the night, listening to the rush soften to a whisper. The maze had done its work, and now it could rest until it was needed again. As the light stretched long across the canyon, Clara stood at the edge of the field, the spot where the windmill shadow would soon fall again. She could see the whole ranch from here, the grazing ground where the cattle now fed in peace, the ditches glinting with silver ribbons of water, the cottonwoods swaying gently in the wash. The wind carried the scent of wet clay and sage, the smell of land that had been defended without a shot fired. She breathed deep. Somewhere far down the trail, the gang she'd walked into town would be cooling in a cell, their boots still heavy, their pride heavier still. The town would be talking already, the story bending and stretching like stories do, but the bones of it would hold. She turned back toward the work waiting for her. There was no triumph in her stride, only purpose. Victory, she knew, was not in the moment you won, but in the days after, when you still had what was yours. They came for her land. They left with their pride drowned and their boots heavy. And the windmill rose again, turning slow, sure, and unbroken, like the widow who kept it.